On the morning of November 1st, 1882, at the northwest corner of Fifth Avenue and 57th Street in Manhattan, architect George Brown Post stood before a limestone foundation that would rise 13 stories above the sidewalk, the largest private residence ever conceived in New York City. Behind him, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, 39 years old and heir to the greatest railroad fortune in America, reviewed the revised blueprints that had expanded the original plan by 40 rooms. The site, purchased for $500,000 from the Colford Jones estate, occupied a full city block, 154 feet along Fifth Avenue, 200 feet along 57th Street, a footprint larger than most European palaces. A dwelling to outlast the Republic, the New York Tribune observed in its coverage of the cornerstone ceremony. Yet within 44 years, the entire structure would be reduced to rubble, its Caen stone facade carted away in wagons, making room for the commercial tower that still stands today. What was built to defy time became, instead, a monument to time's indifference. In the spring of 1879, before the first shovel broke ground at 57th Street, the project existed only as an ambition in the mind of a man who had inherited more wealth than he could comprehend. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, grandson of the Commodore who had built the New York Central Railroad into an empire, found himself at 36 in possession of a fortune estimated at $95 million, roughly $2.8 billion in adjusted currency. He had married Alice Claypool Gwynn in 1867, a woman whose family lineage stretched back to colonial Virginia, and by 1879 they had 5 children crowded into a brownstone at 450 Fifth Avenue that felt, to Alice especially, increasingly inadequate for their station. The Astors had their chateau at 34th Street, a limestone palace designed by Richard Morris Hunt that had opened to gasps in 1856. The Havemeyers were building on Madison Avenue, commissioning Louis Comfort Tiffany to create interiors of almost hallucinogenic opulence. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the self-appointed arbiter of New York society, held court in a ballroom at 34th Street designed to accommodate exactly 400 guests, a number that would define the city's social boundaries for decades, establishing who belonged to society and who did not. Cornelius, who had been raised in comparative modesty despite his name, initially resisted the idea of architectural display. His grandfather, the original Commodore, had lived in a simple Washington Place townhouse well into his 80s and despised ostentation, viewing grand houses as monuments to foolishness rather than wisdom. But Alice understood what Cornelius, trained in railroads and numbers, could not yet see. In Gilded Age New York, architecture was currency. A house was not shelter. It was a declaration of legitimacy, a three-dimensional argument for social dominance, a physical manifestation of power that could be measured in cubic feet and construction costs. Without the proper stage, the Vanderbilt name, already controversial due to the Commodore's reputation for ruthlessness, would remain associated with commerce rather than culture, with railroads rather than refinement. By the summer of 1879, Cornelius had authorized the purchase of the Colford Jones property, a full city block at what was then the northern edge of fashionable Manhattan, far enough from the commercial chaos of Lower Fifth Avenue to maintain residential dignity, but close enough to the new urban corridor being carved through Central Park to signal confidence in the city's northward expansion. The price, $500,000 for the land alone, represented the single largest real estate transaction in Manhattan that year, and newspapers noted it with a mixture of awe and criticism. The New York Herald editorialized, when a single family purchases an entire city block for a residence. One must ask whether such concentration of wealth serves the public good or merely the private ego. The Architectural Commission went to George Brown Post, a 48-year-old graduate of New York University's engineering program, who had studied architecture in the ateliers of Paris and returned to New York with a vision of American monumentality that borrowed from European precedent but insisted on American scale. Post had recently completed the Equitable Life Building on Broadway and the Western Union Building on Lower Broadway, structures that married Beaux-Arts grandeur with modern structural logic, using steel frames hidden behind masonry facades to achieve heights and interior volumes previously impossible. For the Vanderbilt Commission, Post proposed something unprecedented: a French chateau transplanted to Manhattan, but scaled to American proportions and American ambitions. The design borrowed motifs from the chateaux of the Loire Valley, François the Fern at Chambord, Louis the Thuin at Blois, and the urban palaces of the Ile-de-France, but its sheer size dwarfed its European models. The initial plan called for 137 rooms, occupying 154,000 square feet across multiple floors, with ceiling heights ranging from 12 feet in service areas to 30 feet in the principal public spaces. The budget was set at $3 million for construction, a figure that would climb to nearly $6 million by the time the last mosaic tile was laid, the last yard of silk damask hung, the last coat of gilt applied to the ballroom ceiling. This was not renovation or expansion of an existing structure. This was the creation of an entirely new architectural universe, one that would require the importation of materials from 4 continents and the coordination of hundreds of craftsmen speaking half a dozen languages. The first site preparations began in August 1879, with the demolition of the existing structures on the Jones property, a modest townhouse and several outbuildings that were cleared in less than a month. Excavation for the foundation commenced immediately, a process that required digging to bedrock 20 feet below street level through layers of Manhattan schist and glacial till, removing approximately 15,000 cubic yards of earth that was carted away in horse-drawn wagons to fill lots in the developing Upper West Side. Post's engineers, consulting with specialists from the Brooklyn Bridge project, then nearing completion, designed a foundation system that combined traditional masonry with modern concrete, creating a platform capable of supporting a structure whose total weight would exceed 50,000 tons. The foundation walls, 8 feet thick at the base and tapering to 3 feet at ground level, were constructed of granite blocks quarried in Quincy, Massachusetts, each block weighing between 500 and 2,000 pounds, fitted together with minimal mortar in a technique borrowed from Roman engineering. The foundation work consumed the entire winter of 1879-1880, proceeding even through January and February, when temperatures fell below freezing, and workers labored in conditions that today's safety regulations would prohibit. Contemporary accounts describe bonfires burning on the site around the clock, both to warm the workers and to keep the concrete from freezing before it cured. By March 1880, the foundation was complete, and Post's attention turned to the structure that would rise above it. Construction of the superstructure began in April 1880, and from the first day, the project attracted crowds of spectators who gathered at the corner to watch stone masons, iron workers, and carpenters transform the vacant lot into something unprecedented. The exterior walls, 3 feet thick at the base and tapering to 20 inches at the upper floors, were constructed using a hybrid technique that place Post at the forefront of American architectural innovation. The outer face of the walls was clad in caen stone, a pale, fine-grained limestone quarried in Normandy and prized for its warm color and resistance to weathering. Each block arrived at the construction site pre-cut according to Post's specifications, numbered and labeled in French, requiring masons fluent in both languages to interpret the quarry's instructions. The stone was set in careful courses, with joints so tight that, as one newspaper account noted, a knife blade cannot be inserted between the blocks. Behind this limestone veneer, however, the walls were constructed of common brick, millions of red clay bricks manufactured in kilns along the Hudson River, laid in a thick mass that provided structural stability and thermal insulation. This combination of expensive facing stone and practical structural brick was typical of high-end construction in the period, allowing architects to achieve visual magnificence while controlling costs and construction speed. The total quantity of caen stone used in the project exceeded 4,000 tons. The brick count reached an estimated 12 million. The logistics of importing, transporting, and installing these materials required Post to establish relationships with suppliers across the Atlantic and to coordinate delivery schedules with the precision of a military campaign. The building rose slowly, floor by floor, following a construction sequence that prioritized the structural frame over the decorative elements. By the autumn of 1880, the first floor was enclosed, and work had begun on the second floor framing. Here, Post introduced another innovation, a steel skeleton frame concealed within the masonry walls, allowing for larger window openings and more flexible interior layouts than traditional load-bearing construction would permit. The steel beams, rolled in Pittsburgh and transported to New York by rail, on Vanderbilt's own railroad naturally, were assembled by ironworkers who climbed the rising structure without safety equipment, their confidence born of experience rather than regulation. The use of structural steel in residential construction was still experimental in 1880. Most architects reserved it for commercial buildings where the economic advantages of reduced wall thickness and increased floor area justified the added expense. Post, however, saw steel as essential to achieving the spatial grandeur Cornelius and Alice desired. The Grand Hall, for instance, was designed as a two-story volume, measuring 50 by 60 feet with no intermediate columns, an impossibility in traditional masonry construction, but entirely feasible with a steel frame supporting the floors above. Similarly, the ballroom on the second floor would span 60 feet without structural interruption, its ceiling suspended from steel trusses hidden above the decorative plasterwork. These technical achievements, invisible in the finished building, represented Post's most significant contribution to the project, demonstrating that residential architecture could adopt the structural logic of industrial buildings while maintaining the aesthetic vocabulary of European palaces. By the spring of 1881, the structure had reached its full height of 5 stories above ground, 6 if one counted the attic level tucked beneath the mansard roof, and the city could begin to comprehend the scale of what Cornelius Vanderbilt was building. The Fifth Avenue elevation stretched 154 feet, punctuated by 3 projecting pavilions topped with steep copper-clad roofs that rose an additional 30 feet above the main cornice line. These roofs, inspired by François I's additions to the Château de Blois, were sheathed in copper panels that would weather to a distinctive green patina over the coming decades, becoming one of the mansion's most recognizable features when viewed from a distance. The central entrance, positioned beneath the middle pavilion, was recessed beneath a carved stone archway that rose 2 stories and was flanked by columns of polished red granite. Each of these columns, hewn from a single piece of stone extracted from the Quincy quarries, measured 18 feet in length and 30 inches in diameter, and required a specially constructed wagon and a team of 8 horses to transport from the railroad depot to the construction site. The installation of the columns, accomplished using a steam-powered crane and a crew of riggers working over the course of 3 days, was witnessed by several hundred spectators and reported in the newspapers as evidence of modern engineering's triumph over natural limitations. Above the entrance, a limestone balcony extended from the second floor, accessible through French doors in the main drawing room, and supported by caryatids, female figures carved in high relief, executed in Paris by the sculptor Jules Allard, who had trained under the masters of the Second Empire and brought to the commission a level of craftsmanship rarely seen in American architecture. The 57th Street elevation, though less ornate than the Fifth Avenue facade, was equally imposing and more functionally sophisticated. Here, Post designed a porte cochere, a covered carriage entrance, large enough to accommodate 2 carriages simultaneously, allowing guests to arrive and depart without exposure to weather. The porte cochere's ceiling, supported by iron columns disguised as stone, was decorated with carved stone rosettes and painted panels depicting allegorical figures representing the 4 seasons. This feature, common in European palace architecture but still relatively rare in American residential design, signaled the Vanderbilts' intention to adopt the spatial protocols of European aristocracy, where the arrival sequence, the transition from public street to private interior, was carefully choreographed to reinforce social hierarchy and create anticipation. Beyond the porte cochere, the 57th Street facade extended another 150 feet, punctuated by service doors that opened onto a cobblestoned courtyard where delivery wagons could unload coal, food, and supplies without disturbing the family or their guests. This separation of ceremonial and service circulation, a fundamental principle of grand house design, would be maintained throughout the building, with parallel systems of corridors, staircases, and elevators ensuring that servants could move through the house invisibly, appearing only when needed and disappearing immediately thereafter. By the winter of 1881-1882, the exterior envelope was complete, and work shifted to the interior, where the true scale of the project's ambition became apparent. Post had designed the house around a central grand hall that functioned as both architectural spine and social stage, a 2-story volume from which all other rooms radiated. The floor of this hall was to be paved in a geometric pattern of colored marbles: white Carrara from Italy, red Numidian from Algeria, yellow Sienna from Tuscany, green Connemara from Ireland, and pink Tennessee marble from American quarries, each piece cut to precise dimensions and fitted together like a jigsaw puzzle. The marble installation alone consumed 6 months and required the services of Italian craftsmen who had trained in the workshops of Florence and Rome, men whose fathers and grandfathers had laid the floors of churches and palaces across Europe. These craftsmen lived in temporary housing on the construction site, working 10-hour days under the supervision of a foreman who communicated through a translator, their progress measured in square feet per week. The completed floor, covering approximately 3,000 square feet, contained an estimated 50,000 individual pieces of marble, each hand-cut and polished, the joints between them so fine that the overall effect was of a single, seamless surface of almost hypnotic complexity. Visitors entering the Grand Hall for the first time would look down before looking up, drawn by the floor's intricate geometry and rich color, an effect Post had calculated precisely. The floor was the foundation of the spatial experience, the element that grounded visitors before the soaring height of the room lifted their gaze upward. The walls of the Grand Hall presented an equally complex challenge, one that Post resolved through a combination of structural innovation and decorative richness. Rather than plaster over brick, as was standard in residential construction, Post specified that the walls be clad in the same caen stone used for the exterior, creating an interior space that felt more like a medieval great hall than a modern residence. The stone was cut in uniform blocks, each measuring approximately 2 feet by 1 foot by 8 inches, and laid in horizontal courses that emphasized the room's width while maintaining a human scale through the consistent size of the individual stones. This stonework, however, was not load-bearing. It was a veneer attached to the brick structural wall behind it, a distinction that mattered technically but not aesthetically. The effect Post sought and achieved was one of permanence and solidity, a space that would feel ancient even when new, that would suggest continuity with European architectural traditions while asserting American technical prowess. At regular intervals, the stone walls were interrupted by pilasters, flat columns projecting slightly from the wall surface, carved with Corinthian capitals whose acanthus leaves and volutes were modeled after examples from the Temple of Vesta in Rome. These pilasters, purely decorative rather than structural, served to divide the walls into bays and to support, visually, if not literally, the wooden gallery that wrapped around 3 sides of the hall at the second-floor level. This gallery, accessible from the second-floor corridor, allowed family members and guests to look down into the Grand Hall without descending the main staircase, creating opportunities for dramatic entrances and reinforcing the room's function as a stage. The gallery's railing was carved from oak in a Gothic tracery pattern, each panel requiring approximately 60 hours of hand carving by German craftsmen who had been recruited specifically for this work. The gallery floor, though visible from below, was constructed of simple pine planks covered with carpet, a practical choice that reflected Post's understanding that not every surface needed to be precious, only those that would be closely examined. The ceiling of the Grand Hall, 30 feet above the marble floor, was the room's crowning achievement, a tour de force of decorative painting executed by the French artist Paul Baudry, whose reputation had been established through his work on the Paris Opera House. Baudry, approaching 70 and in declining health, did not travel to New York, but instead created the paintings in his Paris studio, working on canvas panels that were shipped to New York and installed in carved wooden frames fitted between the ceiling's structural beams. The paintings depicted allegorical scenes representing commerce, industry, art, and science, themes chosen by Cornelius to honor the sources of his family's wealth while suggesting a broader cultural ambition. Commerce was represented by a female figure holding a caduceus and standing before a harbor filled with ships. Industry by a muscular male figure wielding a hammer beside a locomotive. Art by a woman holding a palette and brush, surrounded by classical sculptures. Science by a bearded scholar examining astronomical instruments. These figures, rendered in Baudry's fluid academic style, occupied circular medallions connected by painted garlands of flowers and ribbons, the whole composition unified by a cream and gold color scheme that reflected and amplified the natural light entering through the hall's tall windows. The windows themselves, 10 in total, each measuring 8 feet wide by 14 feet tall, were another technical achievement, their size made possible by the steel frame concealed within the walls. The glass, imported from Belgium and France, was set in bronze frames, fitted with hardware capable of supporting the weight of each pane, which exceeded 200 pounds. The lower sashes could be raised using a counterweight system hidden within the wall, allowing for ventilation during warm weather, though the house's mechanical systems, which included a primitive form of air conditioning that circulated cooled air through ducts from a basement refrigeration system, meant that opening windows was rarely necessary. The windows were dressed with curtains of silk damask, deep red in color and lined with canvas to block light completely when drawn, though during daylight hours they were pulled back to admit the maximum amount of natural illumination. Light, in Post's design, was both functional and symbolic. The grand hall was meant to be bright, a space where social interactions could be clearly observed and where the architectural details could be properly appreciated. This emphasis on illumination distinguished the Vanderbilt mansion from earlier Gilded Age residences, which had often been quite dark, their interiors lit primarily by gas fixtures and candles that created a romantic but impractical atmosphere. Post, influenced by his Parisian training and by the contemporary movement toward rationalism in architecture, believed that modern life required modern lighting, and he designed the house's window placement and artificial lighting systems, which included both gas and electric fixtures, with the latter becoming more dominant as the city's electrical grid expanded, to ensure that every major room received adequate illumination. From the grand hall, the main staircase ascended to the second floor, a double stair of white Carrara marble that split at a landing and curved upward in 2 symmetrical flights. The design recalled the ceremonial staircases of French chateaux, Fontainebleau, Versailles, but adapted those precedents to a more compact footprint and a residential rather than royal scale. Each step was carved from a single block of marble, as was each section of the balustrade, eliminating joints that might weaken over time or spoil the visual purity of the stone. The handrails, polished to a mirror finish, were carved with a subtle convex profile that fit comfortably in the hand, a detail that Post specified based on anthropometric studies he had conducted, measuring the grip of adult hands to determine the optimal rail diameter and shape. The newel posts at the base of the stairs, rising 6 feet above the floor, were carved with elaborate Renaissance motifs: dolphins, acanthus scrolls, classical urns that required 3 months per post to execute. At the landing, where the stair divided, a large window faced east, overlooking the side yard and admitting morning light that would illuminate the white marble and cause it to glow with an almost ethereal luminosity. This window, though facing a utilitarian side yard rather than a grand vista, was as ornate as any in the house, its bronze frame fitted with stained glass panels, depicting the 4 seasons in the manner of medieval illuminated manuscripts, the glass imported from the studios of Louis Comfort Tiffany, who was then beginning to establish his reputation as America's premier decorative artist. The staircase, which would be photographed countless times over the coming decades and would appear in virtually every published account of the house, represented in concentrated form the entire project's aesthetic and social logic. European sources transformed through American execution, historical motifs adapted to modern functions, and extraordinary craftsmanship deployed in service of domestic grandeur. By the late summer of 1883, with the Grand Hall complete and the principal public rooms on the first and second floors nearing completion, the house's interior had developed the rhythms and systems that would characterize its daily operation for decades. The ground floor, beyond the Grand Hall, contained a suite of interconnected rooms designed for entertaining and for Cornelius's business activities. The main drawing room, accessible through a wide doorway from the Grand Hall, measured 40 by 30 feet and was decorated in a Louis XV style that Alice had chosen after consulting with Jules Allard at Fis, the Parisian decorating firm that had furnished many of the city's grandest residences. The walls were covered in pale green silk damask, stretched over a framework of wooden battens and tacked in place with tiny brass nails spaced at 2-inch intervals, a labor-intensive technique that required 2 craftsmen a full week to complete. The silk itself, woven in Lyon according to an 18th century pattern, cost $50 per yard, and the room required 240 yards, making the wall covering alone more expensive than many Americans' annual income. The ceiling, divided into panels by carved wooden moldings gilded with gold leaf, featured painted medallions by a lesser-known follower of Baudry depicting pastoral scenes, shepherds, nymphs, classical ruins that evoked an idealized Arcadia far removed from the industrial realities that had funded the room's creation. The fireplace, positioned on the south wall, was carved from white Carrara marble in a design that incorporated caryatids, garlands, and a central cartouche bearing the Vanderbilt coat of arms, a heraldic device that, while recently invented, was presented with the authority of centuries. The furniture, a mix of authentic Louis XV pieces acquired at Parisian auctions and high-quality reproductions manufactured by Herder Brothers in New York, was upholstered in silk brocade that complemented the wall covering, and the room's overall effect was one of refined, almost feminine elegance, a deliberate contrast to the more masculine character of the adjacent library. The library, Cornelius's preferred retreat within the house, occupied a corner position that gave it windows on 2 sides, south toward 57th Street and west toward the side yard, ensuring ample natural light for reading. The room's walls were entirely paneled in carved oak, dark with age and imported from a dismantled chateau in Normandy. The paneling, which had been photographed and numbered before being removed from its original location, was reinstalled by French craftsmen who worked from the archival photographs to ensure that each panel returned to its correct position, though the panels were now fitted to a room of different dimensions and had to be subtly adjusted, with new transition pieces carved to match the original work. The ceiling, divided into deep coffers by heavy wooden beams, was painted a dark blue and studded with gilded rosettes, creating the impression of a night sky. Built-in bookcases, fitted between the wall panels, rose from floor to ceiling and were accessed by a rolling ladder whose brass fittings and mahogany rails were as finely crafted as the paneling itself. These shelves would eventually hold Cornelius's collection of books, several thousand volumes ranging from railroad engineering manuals to leather-bound sets of classical literature. But at the time of the house's completion, they stood empty, their bare wood awaiting the accumulation of knowledge and culture that the Vanderbilts hoped would legitimize their social position. The fireplace in the library was more modest than the drawing rooms, carved from a dark green marble veined with white, its mantel supported by simple brackets rather than elaborate figurative sculpture. Above the mantel, Post had designed a recessed panel intended to hold a painting, and here Cornelius would eventually hang a portrait of the Commodore, a visual reminder of the source of the fortune that made everything around him possible. Adjacent to the library, separated by pocket doors that could be opened to create a continuous space or closed for privacy, was Cornelius's office, a room that functioned as a satellite headquarters for his railroad operations. Unlike the decorative richness of the public rooms, the office was furnished with practicality in mind. A large mahogany desk positioned to face the windows, a leather-upholstered swivel chair on casters, filing cabinets along one wall, and a conference table capable of seating 8 executives. A telegraph machine, installed in a wooden cabinet near the desk, was connected by dedicated wire to the railroad's operations center on 42nd Street, allowing Cornelius to receive real-time updates on train movements, freight volumes, and stock prices. A telephone, still a relatively new technology in 1883, sat on a side table, its ornate wooden housing disguising the mechanical simplicity of the device. The walls, paneled in a lighter oak than the library, were hung with framed maps showing the railroad's routes across the Northeast and Midwest, New York to Chicago, Boston to Buffalo, connecting the industrial heartland to the coastal ports through an iron network that the Vanderbilt family controlled. These maps, updated annually to reflect new construction and acquisitions, were both functional references and visual assertions of power, transforming geography into property. A safe, built into the wall and concealed behind a hinged panel, held important documents, stock certificates, and cash for immediate needs. The room's atmosphere was businesslike and efficient, a space where decisions affecting thousands of workers and millions of dollars were made daily, often in conversations that blended family matters with corporate strategy in ways that would later be prohibited by reforms aimed at separating personal and business interests. The dining room, the last of the principal ground floor rooms, was positioned at the rear of the house, overlooking a walled garden that provided a buffer from the commercial development creeping up from the south. The room measured 50 by 35 feet, large enough to accommodate a table that could seat 60 guests when fully extended, though for family meals, a smaller table was used. The walls were covered in tooled leather panels, dyed a deep oxblood red, and embossed with Renaissance patterns of scrolling foliage and mythical creatures. This leather, produced in Córdoba, Spain, according to techniques dating to the Moorish period, cost $30 per square yard and required special training to install, as the panels had to be dampened, stretched, and tacked while wet, then allowed to dry slowly to prevent cracking. The ceiling, similar to the library's, featured heavy wooden beams supporting painted panels depicting hunting scenes, stags, boars, falcons, that evoked the aristocratic leisure pursuits the Vanderbilts aspired to but rarely practiced. The fireplace, though present, was rarely used, as the dining room's temperature was controlled by the central heating system and by the heat generated by the gas chandeliers that hung above the table, each fixture containing dozens of individual flames that, when lit for an evening dinner party, raised the room's temperature by several degrees and required the windows to be opened slightly to prevent the air from becoming oppressively warm. The sideboard, a massive piece of carved walnut that stretched 12 feet along one wall, was fitted with warming compartments lined with zinc and heated by small spirit lamps, allowing food to be kept at serving temperature between courses. The room's acoustics, thanks to the leather wall covering and heavy draperies, were soft and intimate despite the space's size, allowing conversation to be conducted at a normal volume without the echoing effect that plagued many large dining rooms of the period. The second floor of the mansion, reached by the marble staircase from the Grand Hall, was organized around a central corridor that ran the length of the house from north to south, a spatial armature from which the principal family apartments and reception rooms branched. At the Fifth Avenue end, occupying the choicest position in the house, was the ballroom, a space that would become the social heart of the residence and the setting for some of New York society's most lavish entertainments. The room measured 60 feet in length, 30 feet in width, and 30 feet in height. Proportions Post had calculated to create a cube and a half, a Renaissance ratio believed to produce harmonious acoustics and pleasing visual balance. The walls were sheathed entirely in carved oak paneling, not reproduction work, but authentic 16th century panels salvaged from the Château de Montigny in Normandy, which had been partially dismantled in the 1870s, and its architectural elements sold to collectors and dealers across Europe and America. The acquisition of these panels, negotiated through Parisian agents and requiring nearly a year to complete, had added $150,000 to the project's budget. But the result was a room that possessed genuine historical depth, a space where the patina of centuries mingled with the gleam of new gilt to create an atmosphere that was both ancient and freshly minted. The panels, which varied in height from 8 to 12 feet, depending on their original location in the chateau, had been carefully selected for their carved decoration, linen fold patterns, portrait medallions, heraldic devices, and were installed by French craftsmen who understood the visual logic of late Gothic design and could arrange the panels to create a coherent narrative around the room. Even though the narrative itself was largely invented, a pastiche of authentic elements recombined to serve an American client's vision of European grandeur. The ballroom floor, laid in a herringbone pattern using French oak planks, was engineered with a subtle spring that enhanced the experience of dancing. This effect was achieved by supporting the oak surface on a framework of smaller wooden beams separated by air gaps, creating a flexible plane that responded to weight and movement. Dancers would feel the floor give slightly beneath their steps, a physical sensation that added to the pleasure of waltzing or performing the more energetic dances then coming into fashion. The floor's surface was maintained by a servant whose sole responsibility was its care, waxing, buffing, and repairing any damage before each ball, a task that required 2 full days of labor and produced a surface so smooth that women's silk slippers could glide across it with minimal resistance. At the room's northern end, a musician's gallery projected from the wall at a height of 15 feet, accessible via a concealed staircase that allowed musicians to enter and exit without passing through the main room. This gallery, which could accommodate an orchestra of up to 20 performers, was fitted with curved bronze railings that prevented instruments from accidentally falling to the floor below, while allowing sound to project freely into the room. The gallery's positioning, Post later explained in architectural journals, was calculated to distribute music evenly throughout the space, avoiding the dead zones and echoing effects that plagued ballrooms where musicians performed at floor level. The ceiling of the ballroom was the room's most spectacular feature, a composition of carved and gilded coffers, framed by massive wooden beams that were structural in appearance but actually decorative. The true support provided by steel trusses hidden above the decorative layer. The coffers themselves were painted with floral motifs and classical medallions in a cream and gold palette that complemented the oak paneling. And at the room's center hung three enormous crystal chandeliers, each weighing approximately 800 pounds and containing 500 individual crystal prisms that refracted candlelight and later electric light into thousands of rainbow fragments. These chandeliers, manufactured in Paris by Baccarat, the premier crystal producer of the 19th century, were suspended from the structural beams above by steel cables capable of supporting 3 times their actual weight, a safety margin insisted upon by Post after hearing accounts of chandelier failures in European palaces. The installation of the chandeliers, accomplished in November 1883, required the construction of a temporary scaffold that filled the ballroom and took 3 days to erect and another 2 to dismantle after the fixtures were secured. Each chandelier's hundreds of crystals had to be individually hung on bronze armatures, a process requiring manual dexterity and patience, as a single dropped crystal could shatter irreparably on the oak floor below. The 3 chandeliers, lit simultaneously during evening receptions, consumed enormous quantities of wax candles, later replaced by gas and eventually electricity, and generated so much heat that the ballroom's temperature could rise by 10 degrees during a 4-hour event, requiring servants to open windows despite the winter cold outside. The ballroom's windows, 5 on the Fifth Avenue side and 2 on each of the short walls, were dressed with curtains of deep crimson velvet, each panel weighing over 50 pounds and requiring mechanical assistance to open and close. The velvet, woven in Genoa and dyed using cochineal, a pigment derived from insects, possessed a depth of color that appeared almost black in dim light, but revealed its richness when illuminated directly. Behind these heavy curtains hung lighter panels of lace, also imported from Europe, that could filter daylight during afternoon receptions while maintaining privacy from the street below, where curious passers-by often gathered to glimpse the mansion's interior. The windows themselves, though large by residential standards, were smaller than those in the Grand Hall, a conscious choice by Post intended to create a sense of enclosure and intimacy despite the room's vast dimensions. A ballroom, he believed, should feel like a jewel box at night, its boundaries defined by walls and light rather than by views of the exterior world. This inward focus was reinforced by the room's sole connection to the rest of the house, a pair of massive pocket doors that, when opened, created a 20-foot wide opening into the adjacent drawing room, allowing the 2 spaces to function as one during large receptions. These pocket doors, each weighing over 500 pounds, were supported by bronze wheels that ran on concealed tracks, and their movement, smooth, nearly silent, requiring only a gentle push to set in motion, was a minor marvel of mechanical engineering, a demonstration that modern technology could serve historical aesthetics without compromising visual coherence. Adjacent to the ballroom were 2 smaller drawing rooms, each approximately 30 by 25 feet, decorated in complementary but distinct styles that allowed for varied social interactions during large events. The red drawing room, positioned between the ballroom and the main staircase, featured walls covered in crimson silk brocade, furniture upholstered in matching fabric, and a ceiling painted with allegorical scenes representing music and poetry. The room's fireplace, carved from burgundy-veined marble quarried in the French Pyrenees, was surrounded by a bronze frame containing relief panels depicting satyrs and nymphs in forest settings. The metalwork executed by a Paris foundry that specialized in Art Nouveau, designs then beginning to emerge as an alternative to historical revivalism. The room's lighting came from a combination of sources: a single central chandelier of moderate size, wall sconces fitted with silk shades that softened the light, and the natural illumination from three tall windows facing Fifth Avenue. The overall effect was warm and enveloping, a space designed for intimate conversation despite being part of a larger entertaining suite. The furniture, arranged in conversation groups rather than in rigid perimeter alignment, included several sofas upholstered in fabric that matched the walls, armchairs covered in complementary patterns of gold and cream, small side tables of carved rosewood holding decorative objects, bronze figurines, porcelain boxes, silver photograph frames. A piano, a Steinway Grand finished in ebony with bronze hardware, occupied one corner of the room, positioned to allow a performer to face the assembled guests while also catching light from the windows. The blue drawing room, on the opposite side of the ballroom, was decorated in cooler tones: pale blue silk walls, furniture upholstered in silver gray damask, a marble fireplace of white and gray that recalled ancient Greece more than Renaissance France. Here, the ceiling painting depicted maritime commerce and navigation, with ships and compasses and allegorical figures representing trade and discovery, subjects chosen to honor Cornelius's grandfather, who had begun his career operating ferry boats in New York Harbor before building his railroad empire. The room's furniture, though similarly arranged in conversation groups, was of a different period and style from the red drawing room. Louis XVI's pieces, more delicate and rectilinear than the curved forms of Louis XV, upholstered in fabrics that featured classical motifs, Greek key patterns, acanthus leaves, architectural elements rendered in silk thread. A collection of Chinese porcelain, displayed in glass-fronted cabinets along one wall, added exotic notes to the otherwise European aesthetic, reflecting the period's fascination with Asian art and the growing influence of Japanism in decorative tastes. The windows, dressed in layers of lace and silk that filtered Fifth Avenue's northern light to a soft glow, looked out onto the same urban scene as the red drawing room, but from a different angle, offering guests variety within sameness. The family apartments occupied the western half of the second floor, beginning with Cornelius and Alice's suite, which sprawled across approximately 2,000 square feet and included a bedroom, two dressing rooms, a private sitting room, and a bathroom of unprecedented luxury. The bedroom, facing south to maximize sunlight, was decorated in a restrained palette of cream and gold. Its walls hung with silk panels embroidered with botanical patterns. Roses, lilies, peonies rendered in dimensional needlework that had required months of labor by specialized craftswomen in Paris. The bed, a massive carved mahogany piece acquired from an auction of French royal furniture, and reputedly once owned by Marie Antoinette, a claim impossible to verify but useful for social conversation, was fitted with a canopy of gathered silk suspended from a corona attached to the ceiling, creating a tent-like enclosure that provided both visual drama and practical warmth during winter months. The mattress, custom-made to post specifications, rested on a system of metal springs that provided support superior to the rope or slat systems common in most beds of the period. Beside the bed stood matching nightstands of carved walnut, each fitted with gas lighting that could be controlled from the bed itself, an innovation that represented the cutting edge of domestic convenience and eliminated the need for servants to enter the room after the family had retired. The bedroom's fireplace, though functional, was rarely used, as the central heating system maintained consistent temperatures throughout the house, but it remained a symbolic element. Its carved marble mantel and bronze screen suggesting comfort and tradition even when the hearth stood cold. Alice's dressing room, adjacent to the bedroom and accessible through a door concealed within the wall paneling, was fitted with floor-to-ceiling wardrobes of polished walnut, their interiors lined with cedar to protect fabrics from moths and other insects. These wardrobes, custom built to Alice's specifications, contained hanging rods for gowns, shallow drawers for gloves and handkerchiefs, deeper drawers for shoes, and special compartments for hats, each designed to maintain the shape and condition of items that represented significant financial investment. A full-length mirror, set in a carved gilt frame and positioned to catch light from both a skylight above and a south-facing window, occupied the center of one wall, allowing Alice to view herself from multiple angles, an essential tool for a woman whose public appearances were carefully choreographed performances requiring perfect grooming and presentation. The mirror's positioning had been calculated by Post to ensure that both natural and artificial light would illuminate Alice's figure evenly, avoiding the shadows and distortions that plagued many dressing rooms of the period. A marble-topped dressing table, its surface an organized chaos of silver-backed brushes, crystal perfume bottles, ivory combs, and small decorative objects accumulated over years of gift-giving and European travel, stood beneath one window. Here, Alice would sit for an hour or more each morning, attended by her lady's maid, undergoing the complex rituals of grooming, dressing, and adorning that transformed a private individual into a public figure. The adjoining bathroom, though smaller than the dressing room, was equally luxurious and represented the most advanced domestic technology of the era. The walls were clad in white marble veined with gray, the marble cut in large panels and polished to a mirror, finish that reflected and multiplied the room's light. The floor, laid in smaller hexagonal tiles of matching marble, was heated from below by hot water pipes, an extraordinary luxury that ensured comfort even on the coldest winter mornings. The fixtures, tub, sink, toilet, were manufactured by American producers but designed to European standards, their forms combining classical proportions with modern functionality. The tub, carved from a single block of marble rather than the more common enameled iron, measured 7 feet in length and 3 feet in width, large enough for Alice to recline completely while bathing. It was supplied with both hot and cold water through nickel-plated taps, the hot water drawn from a coal-fired boiler in the basement and delivered through an elaborate system of pipes concealed within the walls. The water, heated to a consistent temperature through a primitive but effective mixing valve, could fill the tub in approximately 15 minutes, producing a soothing rush of sound that echoed pleasantly off the marble surfaces. Cornelius's dressing room, smaller and more austere than Alice's, reflected his preference for efficiency over ornament. The room was fitted with simple wooden wardrobes containing his business suits, evening wear, sporting clothes, and the various specialized garments required by his multiple roles: railroad executive, society figure, yacht club member, art collector. Unlike Alice's elaborate dressing rituals, Cornelius's morning routine was swift and businesslike. He rose at 6, bathed, shaved himself, rather than waiting for a valet, dressed, and descended to breakfast by 7, often spending the hour before the rest of the family woke reviewing railroad reports or correspondence in his ground floor office. The dressing room's furnishings were purely functional: a clothes press for removing wrinkles, a boot rack, a small table holding collar boxes and cufflink cases, and a standing mirror of modest size. The room also contained a small wall safe, distinct from the larger safe in his office, where Cornelius kept items of immediate personal importance: his father's pocket watch, a gold piece given to him by the Commodore, and several photographs of deceased family members whose images he preferred to keep private rather than display in public rooms. The private sitting room, shared by Cornelius and Alice, but used primarily by Alice for correspondence and household management, occupied a corner position with windows facing both south and west, ensuring good light throughout most of the day. The room was decorated in a lighter, more informal style than the bedroom. Walls covered in pale yellow silk, furniture upholstered in floral chintz, a carpet of cream and pale green that suggested a garden rather than a formal interior. Here, at a writing desk positioned to catch morning light, Alice conducted the extensive correspondence required by her social position: invitations to be sent, acceptances to be written, condolences to be offered, thank you notes to be composed. The desk, a delicate Louis XVI piece of satinwood and gilt bronze, was fitted with numerous small drawers and compartments, each labeled in Alice's neat hand: invitations received, invitations pending, family correspondence, charity matters, household accounts. This organizational system, refined over years of practice, allowed Alice to manage a social calendar and household that encompassed hundreds of relationships, dozens of servants, and countless details requiring her attention and decision. A small bookcase held reference volumes essential to her work, social registers listing society's membership, etiquette guides defining proper behavior for various occasions, address books containing contact information for everyone from the Astors to the upholsterer who recovered the drawing room furniture annually. The third floor of the mansion was dedicated primarily to the children's apartments and guest accommodations, though the layout revealed hierarchies even within this domestic realm. The children's rooms, 5 bedrooms for Cornelius III, William, Reginald, Gertrude, and Gladys, varied in size and decoration according to age and gender, reflecting Victorian assumptions about child development and appropriate environments for boys versus girls. The boys' rooms, positioned along the Fifth Avenue side to give them the best views and most light, were decorated in styles that contemporary child-rearing literature deemed conducive to masculine development. Dark wood furniture, subdued colors, framed maps, and scientific illustrations on the walls, rather than decorative art. Cornelius III, as the eldest son and heir apparent, had the largest room, approximately 20 by 18 feet, fitted with a desk for schoolwork and business training, bookcases for his growing collection of volumes on history, engineering, and railroad management, and a bed that, unlike his younger brother's narrow singles, was a full double, anticipating his approaching adulthood and eventual marriage. His room's decoration was almost austere: plain cream walls, simple moldings, a single Persian carpet over hardwood floors, as befitted a young man being groomed for serious responsibilities. William and Reginald, the middle sons, had smaller but still comfortable rooms of approximately 15 by 14 feet each, connected by a door that facilitated their close relationship. These brothers, neither burdened with the eldest's responsibilities nor coddled as the youngest, developed a particular closeness that manifested spatially in their frequent movement between rooms and their tendency to gather in whichever space offered the best light or view at any given time. Their rooms were decorated similarly: mahogany furniture, green and brown color schemes, windows facing Fifth Avenue. Those small details reflected individual interests. William's room contained sporting equipment and photographs of athletic achievements, while Reginald's held a growing collection of mechanical toys and gadgets that presaged his later interest in automobiles and aviation. The connecting door, a simple wooden panel that could be locked from either side but rarely was, represented a rare moment of flexibility in the house's otherwise rigid circulation patterns, an acknowledgement that childhood relationships required permeability that adult society forbade. The girls' rooms, positioned on the quieter 57th Street side, reflected Victorian notions of feminine domesticity and the assumption that women required protection from the world's harsher realities. Gertrude's room, decorated when she was 7, but modified as she matured into adolescence and young adulthood, underwent several transformations that traced her development from child to accomplished artist and sculptor. The initial decoration featured wallpaper hand-painted with fairy tale scenes, castles, enchanted forests, princesses in towers, and a canopy bed carved with whimsical motifs of dolphins and seashells, its posts wrapped in pale blue fabric that matched the window curtains. As Gertrude aged, however, the room's character shifted. The fairy tale wallpaper was replaced with simpler cream-colored silk. The canopy was removed to reveal the bed's more austere carved headboard, and a large work table was installed beneath the south windows, where Gertrude could draw and model clay under optimal light. This table, stained with ink and clay dust despite servants' efforts to keep it clean, became the center of Gertrude's increasingly serious artistic work, and by her late teens, the room functioned less as a bedroom and more as a studio. Its walls hung with her own sketches and small sculptural studies, rather than with the decorative prints that adorned most young women's chambers. Gladys, 6 years younger than Gertrude, had a smaller room decorated in pink and white, colors chosen by Alice, and reflecting conventional assumptions about girlhood rather than Gladys's own preferences. The furniture, painted in cream enamel and decorated with gold highlights, included a bed with a tufted headboard, a small dressing table with a heart-shaped mirror, and a wardrobe whose doors were paneled with scenes from children's literature. The overall effect, though undeniably pretty, struck visitors as somewhat cloying, and Gladys herself, in later memoirs, recalled feeling oppressed by the room's excessive femininity and longing for the plainer, more serious atmosphere of her brother's quarters. The room's one redeeming feature, from Gladys's perspective, was its west-facing window, which captured afternoon and evening light and offered views over the rear garden and, beyond it, the roofscape of the developing city. A view that suggested possibilities beyond the pink and white cage of her immediate surroundings. Both girls' rooms opened onto a shared playroom, a large space of approximately 30 by 20 feet that functioned as a daytime gathering place for all the children when they were not at lessons or outdoor activities. This room, decorated in cheerful but durable materials, washable wallpaper, painted wooden furniture, rag rugs that could be easily cleaned, contained the accumulated toys and games of 5 children across a decade of birthdays and Christmases. A magnificent rocking horse carved by German craftsmen, its mane made of real horsehair and its saddle of tooled leather. A large dollhouse modeled after an English manor and fitted with miniature furniture of museum-quality craftsmanship. Sets of tin soldiers representing various historical armies. Board games imported from Europe and America. Children's books in multiple languages. And various mechanical toys. Wind-up trains, dancing bears, musical boxes that represented the era's fascination with automation and machinery. The playroom's windows overlooked the side yard, offering less dramatic views than the front rooms, but more privacy, allowing the children to play without feeling observed by passers-by. A large table in the room's center could accommodate drawing, puzzles, or tea parties, and low bookcases along the walls held picture books and early readers organized by the governess according to age-appropriate categories. The nursery, positioned at the rear of the third floor and separated from the main corridor by a small vestibule that served as a sound buffer, was the domain of the governess, a succession of English, French, and German women who enforced routines of lessons, meals, and exercise with varying degrees of strictness and success. The nursery suite included a day room for instruction and supervised play, a small dining room where the children took breakfast and tea under the governess's watchful eye, and the governess's own bedroom, a modest chamber that, while comfortable by the standards of servant accommodations, was plainly furnished and lacking any decorative richness. The day room's walls were painted in cheerful colors, yellow, pale green, light blue, and hung with educational charts showing the alphabet in ornamental letters, multiplication tables decorated with illustrations of objects to count, maps of the world with various countries color-coded by continent, and botanical illustrations labeled with Latin names alongside common ones. These charts, frequently updated as pedagogical theories evolved and as the children's educational needs changed, transformed the walls into a constantly shifting curriculum, a three-dimensional textbook that surrounded the children during their waking hours. A large toy chest, carved from oak and fitted with a brass lock, whose key the governess wore on a chain around her waist, stood against one wall. This chest contained items deemed inappropriate for unsupervised play. Paint sets that might stain furniture, scissors that might cause injury, sophisticated mechanical toys whose delicate mechanisms might be damaged by rough handling. The locked chest was a source of fascination and occasional frustration for the children, who learned early that adult authority manifested not only in direct commands, but in spatial controls. Locked doors, forbidden rooms, objects placed tantalizingly out of reach. The nursery windows, fitted with brass guards to prevent falls, overlooked the rear garden, a walled enclosure of approximately 1 acre where the children could play outdoors under supervision, protected from the public's gaze by 12-foot brick walls, topped with decorative but functional iron spikes. This garden, planted with hardy shrubs and lawn, rather than the ornamental gardens favored for adult entertainment, included a swing set, a small playhouse modeled after a Swiss chalet, and graveled paths where the children could ride tricycles and, later, bicycles. The fourth floor, the mansion's uppermost level of finished interior space, presented the starkest contrast in the house's carefully calibrated social geography. The front half contained additional guest rooms and overflow family quarters, spaces that, while simpler than those on the floors below, retained many luxury features. Hardwood floors of oak rather than pine, plastered ceilings with modest decorative molding, functioning fireplaces fed by the central heating system's upper branches, and adequate natural light from properly proportioned windows. These rooms, numbered 6 through 9 in the household's internal accounting system, were decorated in simplified versions of the historical styles deployed more lavishly below. One in restrained federal revival, another in modest colonial, a third in simplified arts and crafts, the fourth in understated Victorian. Each was fitted with a small adjacent bathroom, simple but functional, with white ceramic fixtures and practical tile work that ensured guest comfort without the elaborate marble and bronze of the family floors. The rear half of the fourth floor, however, was given over entirely to servant accommodations, and here the mansion's underlying economic logic became brutally apparent. The transition from guest to servant territory was marked by a change in flooring, from hardwood to painted pine, and in wall treatment, from decorated plaster to plain whitewash. The servant quarters consisted of 16 small rooms, some as narrow as 8 feet wide by 10 feet deep, fitted with iron bedsteads, plain wooden dressers, and minimal decoration. A single small mirror, a wooden chair, a hook on the back of the door for hanging clothing. These constituted the sum of furnishings for most rooms. The walls, whitewashed annually but never papered or painted in colors, bore the marks of years of occupancy, nail holes from pictures and religious icons, stains from water leaks, cracks in the plaster repaired but not disguised. The ceilings, bare plaster without molding, were low, barely 7 feet in some areas, creating spaces that felt oppressive despite adequate square footage. Windows were small and positioned high on the walls, providing ventilation and minimal daylight, but little view and no sense of connection to the world beyond. These windows, fitted with simple wooden sashes and cheap glass, rattled in winter winds and admitted drafts that no amount of stuffing with rags could entirely eliminate. The rooms were assigned according to the household's rigid hierarchy. The butler, as senior male servant, received one of the larger rooms, approximately 10 by 12 feet, in a corner position with 2 windows. His room contained not only the standard iron bed and dresser, but also a small desk for managing household accounts and staff schedules, a decent armchair, and a locked trunk for his personal possessions, and the various keys he was responsible for safeguarding. The housekeeper, as senior female servant, had a comparable room on the opposite side of the floor, similarly furnished, but with the addition of a sewing table where she could repair linens and perform the endless mending required by a household of this size. Below them in the hierarchy, the ladies' maids and valets occupied individual rooms of moderate size, 8 by 10 feet, while lower servants doubled or even tripled up in the smallest spaces. 2 housemaids might share a room barely large enough for 2 narrow beds and a single shared dresser. Laundresses, who were among the lowest paid servants and whose work was considered the least skilled, often slept 3 to a room and beds so close together that occupants had to take turns dressing. These cramped quarters were cold in winter despite the central heating system, which prioritized the family floors and left the servant areas inadequately heated. Servants routinely woke to find frost on the inside of their windows and water frozen in the pitchers they used for washing. In summer, the top floor became nearly unbearable, the roof above absorbing the sun's heat and radiating it downward into spaces with poor ventilation and no cooling systems. Servants slept with windows open, despite the noise from the street and the insects that flew in, desperate for any breeze that might make the stifling rooms tolerable. The servants spent little time in these rooms beyond sleeping, typically 6 to 7 hours per night, though some positions required less, as their waking hours were consumed by the labor required to maintain the household. A housemaid's day began at 5:30 a.m., with lighting fires in the family bedrooms, before the family woke, and ended near midnight after the last dishes from dinner parties were washed and put away. Sunday afternoons, from 2 until 6 o'clock, were designated as free time, though even these hours were often interrupted by unexpected demands from the family or by the necessity of preparing for Monday's resumption of the full work schedule. The servants' bathroom facilities, shared rather than private, consisted of 2 water closets and 2 small washrooms for 16 people, a ratio that would be considered inadequate in even the most basic modern housing, but was typical for the period's grand houses. The washrooms contained simple tin tubs, cold water taps, and basic soap, and servants bathed according to a schedule posted by the housekeeper. Upper servants twice weekly, lower servants once weekly, with violations of the schedule, either too frequent bathing, which wasted water and time, or insufficient bathing, which reflected poorly on the household standards, subject to rebuke. The servants' dining room, located on the ground floor adjacent to the kitchen and separated from the family dining room by several layers of doors and corridors, was a plain space with whitewashed walls, a long wooden table flanked by benches, and no decoration beyond a clock that regulated the day's rhythms. Meals were served in strict hierarchical order. The upper servants, butler, housekeeper, ladies' maids, valets, ate first and received better portions. The lower servants ate afterward and made do with what remained. The food itself was plain and filling: bread, potatoes, tough cuts of meat, basic vegetables, nothing like the elaborate cuisine prepared for the family upstairs, though occasionally, after large dinner parties, servants might receive leftover delicacies that provided a rare taste of the luxury they served but did not share. The mansion's basement, extending beneath the entire footprint of the house, and in some areas carved 2 levels deep into the Manhattan schist bedrock, contained the mechanical systems and service areas that made life on the floors above possible. And here, the industrial logic underlying domestic comfort was laid bare. The largest space was the kitchen, a high-ceilinged room positioned directly beneath the ground floor dining room and connected to it by both a service elevator, a mechanical cage operated by rope and pulley, and capable of carrying meals and dishes but not people, and a service staircase wide enough for 2 servants to pass while carrying laden trays. The kitchen was dominated by 2 massive coal-fired ranges, each measuring 10 feet in length and fitted with multiple ovens, warming compartments, and surface burners that could accommodate dozens of pots and pans simultaneously. These ranges, manufactured by a Philadelphia firm specializing in institutional cooking equipment and costing $800 each, required constant feeding with coal hauled from the adjacent fuel room and constant tending by the cook and assistant cooks, who regulated temperature by adjusting the amount of fuel loaded into the fireboxes and the position of dampers in the elaborate flue system that vented combustion gases to the roof 5 stories above. The ranges produced enormous, almost unbearable heat, making the kitchen a hellish environment during summer months, despite 2 large windows that opened onto an exterior light well and several ceiling-mounted fans powered by belts connected to a small steam engine. In July and August, the kitchen's temperature regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the cook and her assistants worked in conditions that would be considered unsafe by modern standards. Their faces flushed and streaming with sweat, their clothing soaked, their feet swelling in their shoes from standing on unyielding floors for 10 to 12 hours daily. The kitchen's walls were clad in white ceramic tile from floor to ceiling, a practical choice that allowed for easy cleaning but created a cold, institutional atmosphere and amplified every sound, transforming the space into an echoing chamber of clanging pots, barked orders, and sizzling food. The floor was covered in hexagonal ceramic tiles in a black and white pattern, practical and durable, but offering no comfort to feet that stood on them from before dawn until after midnight, 6 days per week. Adjacent to the kitchen were specialized rooms for different aspects of food preparation and storage, each designed according to the elaborate division of labor characteristic of grand households. The pastry room, positioned on the north side of the basement where it remained coolest, had marble countertops whose temperature stayed consistently below ambient air temperature, essential for working with butter-based doughs and delicate confections. The scullery, where dishes were washed, contained deep soapstone sinks, supplied with both hot and cold water, and fitted with wooden drain boards, where clean dishes were stacked to dry. Here, 2 or 3 scullery maids worked continuously during and after meals, their hands raw from constant immersion in hot soapy water, their arms aching from the repetitive motions of scrubbing and rinsing. The silver pantry, a small, secure room accessible only through the butler's pantry, contained felt-lined drawers and cabinets holding the family's extensive collection of flatware, serving pieces, and decorative objects, several thousand pieces, whose combined value exceeded $50,000. A work table in the center of this room was where the silver was polished, a task requiring several hours per week and performed by junior footmen using a paste made from chalk and ammonia that left their hands stained and smelling of chemicals. The china pantry, adjacent to the silver pantry, housed thousands of pieces of dinnerware arranged in glass-fronted cabinets that lined the walls. Multiple complete services, each containing settings for 60 guests, decorated with different patterns for different occasions. Breakfast china was relatively simple, with small floral motifs on white porcelain. Luncheon china was slightly more elaborate, with broader borders and more complex decoration. Dinner china was the most ornate, with heavy gold borders, complex coat of arms designs, and hand-painted details. Each service had been commissioned from European or American manufacturers according to Alice's specifications, and each represented an investment of several $1,000s. The pantry also held serving pieces, platters, tureens, sauce boats, vegetable dishes, in corresponding patterns, as well as an array of specialty items, asparagus servers, fish knives, ice cream plates, oyster forks, champagne flutes, and dozens of other items designed for specific foods and courses in the elaborate meals that characterized formal entertaining. The wine cellar, one of the few basement spaces accorded any architectural dignity, occupied a separate chamber beneath the main house's western wing, accessible through a heavy oak door fitted with an iron lock. Inside, brick vaulting spanned the space, creating a series of barrel-vaulted bays that helped maintain constant temperature and humidity, essential for proper wine storage. The cellar was lit by electric bulbs rather than gas fixtures, as Cornelius feared that an open flame near alcohol vapors might cause a fire that could destroy his collection, and potentially spread through the wooden house above. The walls were lined with diamond-shaped racks holding hundreds of bottles arranged by region, vintage, and type. Bordeaux, from classified estates, Burgundy, from famous domains, Champagne from the great houses of Rennes and Epernay, Madeira and Port, from long-established shippers, German Rieslings from the Rhine and Mosel valleys, and a selection of American wines from California that Cornelius included more from patriotic duty than genuine appreciation. A locked iron gate controlled access to the cellar, and the butler kept the only key on a chain he wore constantly, even while sleeping. A security measure that reflected both the collection's value, estimated at $30,000, and the period's pervasive concern about servant theft, whether real or imagined. The laundry, though technically part of the basement complex, occupied a separate structure behind the main house, connected by a covered walkway that allowed servants to transport soiled linens and clothing without exposure to weather. This building, a utilitarian brick structure of 2 stories with minimal architectural ornament, contained equipment that represented the cutting edge of domestic technology, but created working conditions that bordered on the inhumane. The ground floor housed mechanized washing machines, large wooden drums fitted with internal paddles and powered by a steam engine that agitated clothes and linens in boiling soapy water for periods ranging from 30 minutes to several hours depending on the degree of soiling. The machines, though more efficient than hand washing, were dangerous. The exposed belts and gears that connected them to the steam engine had caused several serious injuries to laundresses over the years, and the constant noise of the machinery, a thunderous rumbling and clanking that made conversation impossible, left workers partially deaf by middle age. The second floor of the laundry building contained heated mangles for pressing sheets and tablecloths, drying racks that could be hoisted to the ceiling using rope and pulley systems, and ironing stations where women worked in teams, passing garments between stations as different steps of the pressing process were completed. The mangles, large rollers heated internally by gas flames, required 2 operators working in careful coordination, one feeding fabric into the mechanism, the other receiving it on the opposite side, both maintaining constant vigilance to prevent the machinery from catching fingers or pulling in loose clothing. The ironing stations, arranged in a long row beneath north-facing windows that provided consistent daylight, were equipped with heavy cast-iron sad irons heated on gas rings. Each station held multiple irons at various temperatures. Very hot for damask and heavy linens, medium for cotton, cool for silk and delicate fabrics. The women who worked these stations, their faces flushed from the heat and their shoulders aching from the repetitive motion, developed an intuitive sense of proper iron temperature, testing the heat by spitting on the iron surface and listening to how quickly the droplet evaporated, a technique passed down through generations of laundresses but foreign to the women who wore the clothes being pressed. The scale of the laundry operation was staggering and gives some sense of the consumption patterns that characterized grand households of the period. A typical week's wash for the family and staff included approximately 200 sheets and pillowcases, 150 bath and hand towels, 300 personal garments, ranging from nightgowns to petticoats to shirts and drawers, 50 tablecloths and several hundred napkins, and miscellaneous items, curtains, slip covers, dust cloths, kitchen towels, that brought the total to well over 1,000 pieces. After large entertaining events, these numbers could double or even triple as every surface textile in the public rooms was laundered to remove traces of coal smoke food odors, and perfume. The labor required to process this volume employed 6 women full-time in the laundry building and 2 additional staff members who sorted soiled items, transported clean items back to the house, and maintained the elaborate inventory system that ensured each item returned to its proper location. The laundry's heat and humidity, especially during summer, created conditions that would today be considered unsafe. Women fainted regularly from heat exhaustion, were revived with cold water and smelling salts, and returned to work as soon as they could stand, as there were no provisions for sick leave and absence meant loss of wages. The heating system, the house's mechanical heart, and the engineering achievement that made the entire domestic operation possible occupied a large chamber beneath the central section of the house, a sooty, coal-black space dominated by 3 massive boilers that generated steam distributed throughout the building via an elaborate network of pipes running through walls, beneath floors, and inside decorative elements. Each boiler, standing 8 feet tall and measuring 6 feet in diameter, was capable of heating approximately 50,000 cubic feet of interior space when operating at full capacity. The boilers consumed 40 tons of coal during an average winter, coal delivered by wagons that rumbled down the 57th Street service entrance twice weekly, emptying their loads down a metal chute into the basement coal room, where it accumulated in black mountains sorted by size. Large lumps for the boiler's initial firing, medium pieces for sustained burning, small pieces and slack for overnight banking. The coal room, lit by a single electric bulb and thick with black dust that coated every surface and was inhaled with every breath, was among the most unpleasant spaces in the house, avoided by all staff except the firemen, whose job required them to enter it multiple times daily. The boilers required constant supervision and skilled operation to function safely and efficiently. Fires had to be stoked hourly to maintain consistent steam pressure, which was monitored by gauges mounted on each boiler's front panel. Ash had to be removed twice daily, a filthy task accomplished by raking still hot clinkers from beneath the fire grates and shoveling them into metal buckets that were then hauled up a service stair and dumped in a dedicated ash pit in the rear yard. Water levels had to be monitored continuously to prevent boiler failure, a potentially catastrophic event that could result in a steam explosion capable of destroying the boiler, flooding the basement with scalding steam, and potentially killing anyone nearby. Such failures, while rare, were not unknown in large buildings of the period, and newspapers regularly reported incidents where boiler explosions had killed workers and destroyed property. The responsibility for preventing such disasters fell to the man the household called simply the fireman, actually a skilled engineer who had trained for years to understand the complex thermodynamics of steam generation and the mechanical behavior of the boilers under various operating conditions. The fireman lived in the basement in a small room adjacent to the boiler chamber, a space barely large enough for a narrow bed, a chair, and a small table. His sleep was interrupted multiple times each night. He set an alarm clock that woke him every 2 hours to check gauges, add fuel to the fires, and ensure that the system continued operating smoothly. His work was the most physically demanding in the household, shoveling coal, raking ash, climbing stairs repeatedly while carrying heavy buckets, and working in temperatures that in the boiler room routinely exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit even in winter. Yet despite the skill required and the critical importance of his work, the fireman was among the lowest paid servants in the household, earning approximately $25 per month, plus room and board. Less than the butler maid, less than the housekeeper, less even than some of the housemaids. This contradiction reflected the period's general devaluation of manual labor, compared to positions requiring direct interaction with the family, a hierarchy that would persist until labor reforms in the early 20th century began to challenge such assumptions. Beyond the heating system, the basement contained a maze of additional mechanical and storage spaces that reveal the complexity of maintaining a grand house before modern conveniences simplified domestic life. A refrigeration room, located beneath the northern wing of the house, where it remained naturally cool, was fitted with an early ice-based cooling system. Large blocks of ice, delivered weekly and stored in insulated compartments, cooled the surrounding air, which was then circulated through the room by natural convection. Perishable foods, meat, dairy products, fresh produce, were stored on marble shelves in this room, though the system's capacity was limited and most fresh ingredients had to be purchased and used within a day or two. A root cellar, carved directly into the bedrock beneath the house's northwestern corner, provided long-term storage for potatoes, turnips, carrots, and other vegetables that could survive for months in the cool, dark, humid conditions. This cellar, accessed through a narrow staircase from the basement level, was among the oldest parts of the house's infrastructure, dating to the original Jones property and incorporated into Post's design as a cost-saving measure. A coal storage room, separate from the boiler room's daily supply and holding reserve fuel for the entire winter, occupied a large space beneath the southern wing, its walls and ceiling blackened by decades of accumulated dust. This room could hold approximately 15 tons of coal at full capacity, representing roughly 1/3 of a winter's consumption, with the balance delivered in multiple shipments as weather permitted. Access to this room was through a street-level hatch that could be opened to receive coal deliveries directly from wagons above, eliminating the need for human transport and saving hours of labor. A carpenter's shop, fitted with workbenches, tool cabinets, and a small forge for metal repairs, allowed for immediate response to the countless minor repairs required by a house of this size. Doors that stuck, windows that wouldn't open, furniture joints that loosened, floorboards that squeaked. The household employed a full-time carpenter handyman, whose responsibilities included not only these repairs, but also seasonal tasks like installing and removing storm windows, maintaining the extensive wooden shutters that protected windows during winter, and constructing temporary structures, platforms, stages, seating arrangements required for large entertaining events. An upholstery room, smaller but well lit by a window well, contained sewing machines, cutting tables, and shelves of fabric remnants, allowing for the constant repair and refreshment of the house's extensive soft furnishings. 2 seamstresses worked in this room several days per week, mending torn upholstery, replacing worn curtain linings, constructing slipcovers for summer use, and performing the countless other textile tasks required to maintain the house's appearance. The room also served as a repository for fabric samples and trim from the house's original decoration, carefully labeled and stored against future need. A practice that proved invaluable when, years later, sections of damaged fabric had to be replaced with matching material. A luggage storage room held the family's extensive collection of trunks, suitcases, hat boxes, and specialized carrying cases for everything from riding boots to evening shoes. Each piece labeled with the family member's name and maintained in good repair against seasonal migrations to Newport, travel to Europe, or shorter excursions to country estates. These items, representing a significant investment and essential to the peripatetic lifestyle of the wealthy, were inspected regularly by a junior footman, whose responsibilities included ensuring that leather was polished, brass fittings were gleaming, and any damage was repaired immediately. Finally, a series of storage rooms held the overflow of a household whose accumulation of objects constantly threatened to exceed available display space. Extra furniture rotated seasonally between rooms. Out-of-season decorative objects like Christmas ornaments and summer garden furniture. Surplus kitchen equipment used only for large entertaining events, and the slowly accumulating detritus of family life. Children's outgrown toys, discontinued china patterns, outdated curtains saved against uncertain future need. These rooms, lit poorly and ventilated inadequately, were the house's unconscious memory, spaces where obsolete objects waited in dim silence, gradually forgotten, but never quite discarded, their presence a reminder that even in a house built for grandeur, the basic human tendency toward accumulation could not be entirely suppressed by even the most rigorous household management. The basement's atmosphere, dark, damp, pervaded by coal smoke and cooking odors and the metallic smell of steam and hot iron, stood in stark contrast to the light-filled, perfumed elegance of the rooms above. Yet the two realms were inseparable. The beauty above required the labor below. The leisure of the family depended upon the toil of the servants. The appearance of effortless grandeur masked an industrial operation of considerable complexity. This relationship, so fundamental to Gilded Age society, yet so carefully concealed from casual observers, was literally built into the house's structure. The elegant marble floors of the grand hall rested on steel beams, supported by masonry walls that were, at their foundation, seated on the roof of the basement service realm. Architecture, in this sense, was not merely a stage set for social performance, but a physical manifestation of class relations, a three-dimensional diagram of power relations that determined who lived in light and who worked in shadow, who was served and who served, who was seen and who remained invisible. Post, in designing the house, had created not just rooms and corridors, but a complete social system, one that functioned smoothly, precisely because its mechanisms were hidden, its labor force rendered invisible by the same architectural intelligence that made the family's life appear gracious, elegant, and, above all, effortless. By the time the house was substantially complete in late 1883, the total cost had reached approximately $6 million, double the original budget, and equivalent to roughly $180 million in adjusted currency. This figure included the land purchase, construction, interior decoration, mechanical systems, and furnishings, making it one of the most expensive private residences ever built in America to that point. The cost overruns, though substantial, troubled Cornelius less than they might have, as his fortune continued to grow faster than he could spend it. The railroad's revenues increased year over year, and his investments in real estate, banking, and industrial companies multiplied his wealth even as he devoted millions to building and maintaining his various residences. The mansion represented perhaps 6% of his total wealth, a significant but not overwhelming commitment for a man whose annual income exceeded $5 million from railroad dividends alone. For Alice, the house's completion represented the achievement of a long-held ambition. She had secured for the Vanderbilt family a physical monument that proclaimed their arrival among New York's social elite, a stage upon which she could perform the role of society hostess with resources that few could match. For Post, the mansion represented a professional triumph, a demonstration that American architects could create buildings rivaling Europe's greatest palaces, that modern engineering and traditional aesthetics could be successfully combined, and that his particular vision of Beaux-Arts monumentality adapted to American conditions could find expression at the highest level of patronage. The house would stand for 44 years, serving multiple generations of Vanderbilts and witnessing the family's gradual transformation from railroad builders to society figures to, eventually, symbols of an era that had passed. During those decades, the mansion would host thousands of guests, employ hundreds of servants, consume millions of dollars in operating expenses, and generate countless photographs and descriptions that would fix its image in the cultural memory of Gilded Age New York. But from the moment of its completion, the house's fate was sealed by forces its builders could not control. The inexorable rise in Manhattan real estate values, the changing economics of domestic service, the shifting tastes that would make grand historicist architecture seem pompous rather than noble, and the simple fact that architecture, however solidly built, cannot guarantee its own survival against the combined pressures of time, economics, and cultural change. In the early years of the 20th century, the house at First West 57th Street settled into patterns that would characterize its remaining decades, periods of intensive use alternating with months of relative quiet, as the family's seasonal migrations took them to Newport in summer, to various country estates in autumn and spring, and occasionally to Europe for extended tours. During the family's absences, a reduced staff maintained the house, covering furniture with dust sheets, closing shutters, and performing deep cleaning and maintenance that was impossible during occupancy. These quiet periods, though representing dereliction from the house's original purpose, were actually essential to its survival. The constant entertaining that characterized the social season wore heavily on fabrics, furniture, and finishes, and the maintenance work performed during off-seasons prevented the gradual deterioration that could accumulate into serious structural and aesthetic problems. Yet even during these maintenance periods, the house was never entirely empty or quiet. The mechanical systems continued operating, requiring the firemen's constant presence. The basic household staff, butler, housekeeper, cook, a few maids, remained in residence to guard the property and keep it ready for the family's potential unannounced return. And various tradespeople, painters, upholsterers, plasterers, carpet cleaners, moved through the rooms performing the endless repairs required by a building of this size and complexity. The neighborhood around 57th Street, meanwhile, was transforming in ways that would ultimately doom the mansion's residential future. Commercial development crept northward along Fifth Avenue, replacing earlier mansions with retail buildings, hotels, and apartment houses. The reservoir across the avenue, which had provided the mansion with an open green view when it was built, was demolished in the 1890s to make way for the New York Public Library's monumental Carrere and Hastings building, a construction project that lasted more than a decade and filled the mansion's rooms with noise and dust. Cultural institutions followed. Carnegie Hall opened at 7th Avenue and 57th Street, exceeding $1 million, more than justifying the demolition cost and new construction expense. The demolition, when it finally began in the spring of 1926, proceeded with a methodical precision that was almost archaeological in character. The consortium of real estate investors who had purchased the property in 1918, recognized that many of the house's components retained significant value and could be salvaged and sold, offsetting some of the demolition cost while appealing to collectors and other wealthy homeowners seeking to incorporate pieces of Vanderbilt grandeur into their own residences. A specialized salvage firm was hired to systematically dismantle the house, beginning at the top and working downward, removing and cataloging everything of value before the structural demolition began. The copper roof panels, still sound after 43 years, were carefully unbolted and lowered by crane to flatbed trucks, destined for resale to buildings under construction across the city. The slate shingles, hand-cut in Vermont and fitted with individual copper nails, were stacked in crates for sale to restoration projects. The mansard framing, heavy oak timbers joined with traditional mortise and tenon carpentry, was disassembled piece by piece, each timber marked with chalk notations indicating its original position, though these markings would prove futile as the timbers were eventually scattered among various buyers, and no one attempted to reconstruct the original configuration. The interior fixtures commanded the highest prices and received the most careful handling during removal. The crystal chandeliers from the ballroom, each weighing 800 pounds and containing 500 individual prisms, required a team of riggers 3 days to detach and lower through a temporary opening cut in the floor specifically for this purpose. They were crated with extraordinary care, each crystal wrapped in tissue paper, each bronze armature cushioned with straw, the entire assembly secured in custom wooden boxes, and transported to auction houses on Madison Avenue, where they would eventually be sold. 2 of the 3 chandeliers went to hotels, one to Chicago, another to Philadelphia, where they hung in lobbies for decades before those buildings, too, were demolished in the endless cycle of urban renewal. The 3rd chandelier disappeared into a private collection, and its current location, if it still exists, is unknown. The carved oak paneling from the library, those authentic 16th century panels imported from a Normandy chateau and installed with such care, was pried from the walls in sections, numbered for future reference, and loaded onto trucks bound for a warehouse in New Jersey. Some panels eventually reappeared in a private club on Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia, installed in a room of different proportions where the sections didn't quite fit, and the joints between original and filler panels were clearly visible to anyone who looked carefully. Other panels were sold separately to various buyers and today exist in scattered locations: a decorative arts museum in Boston, a private library in Connecticut, a restaurant in Midtown Manhattan. Their provenance documented, but their original spatial relationship lost forever. The marble was perhaps the most valuable salvage, and its removal consumed the longest portion of the demolition process. The Carrara, the Numidian, the Sienna, the Connemara, the Tennessee Pink, all the exotic stones that had been cut and fitted so precisely into the Grand Hall's floor, were chiseled free from their mortar beds by stone masons, many of them immigrants who had worked on the house's original construction 43 years earlier, and now, in old age, were employed in its dismantling. Each piece was marked with its original position, photographed in situ, and cataloged, creating an archive that documented the floor's geometry even as the floor itself was destroyed. The double marble staircase, those 2 flights of white Carrara that had been photographed so many times and had become one of the mansion's most iconic features, took 2 weeks to dismantle. Each step, each section of balustrade, each carved newel post was marked, numbered, and removed, the pieces accumulating in a stone yard where they awaited buyers. The staircase was never reassembled. The economic and spatial requirements for installing such an elaborate element in another building proved impossible to meet, and the individual pieces were eventually sold to various purchasers. Some steps became thresholds in other grand houses. Some balusters were incorporated into garden walls, and some pieces were sold to monument companies where they were recut for mausoleums and grave markers, an ironic afterlife for material chosen to symbolize permanence and social triumph. The demolition of the structure itself, once the valuable fixtures had been removed, proceeded more rapidly and with less reverence. Workers used jackhammers and sledgehammers to break apart the plaster ceilings, revealing the steel beams that had supported them. These beams, still structurally sound, were cut apart with acetylene torches, the metal destined for scrap yards, where it would be melted down and recycled into new construction. The brick walls, millions of individual bricks laid with such care, were demolished floor by floor, the bricks tumbling into the house's interior, where they accumulated in massive piles before being loaded into trucks and hauled away. Some bricks were cleaned and sold for reuse in other construction projects. Most were crushed for fill material or simply dumped in vacant lots on the city's periphery. The Caen stone facade, that pale limestone that had given the house its distinctive character, was the last major element to fall. Workers separated the stone blocks from their mortar beds using jackhammers, a process that filled the air with white dust visible from blocks away, and that prompted complaints from residents of nearby buildings about the grit that settled on their windowsills and infiltrated their apartments despite closed windows. The stone blocks, though architecturally significant, proved difficult to sell. They were too large for most residential applications, too elaborately carved for new commercial buildings that favored clean modern lines, and too expensive to store while awaiting potential buyers. Some blocks were purchased by collectors and eventually installed as decorative elements in suburban estates. Most were simply broken up for aggregate or dumped. The 57th Street entrance, that elaborate composition of carved limestone, red granite columns, and bronze fittings, was the final piece to be removed. Preservationists, recognizing that the entire building would not be saved, lobbied intensively to preserve at least this entrance, proposing that it be relocated to Central Park or installed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art as an example of Gilded Age architecture. The New York Times ran an editorial supporting this proposal, arguing that, while economic progress may require the demolition of the mansion itself, surely the city has an obligation to preserve some fragment of its architectural heritage. The proposal generated public discussion and even some political support, but ultimately foundered on practical obstacles. The entrance weighed an estimated 30 tons. Its removal and transportation would cost approximately $50,000, and no institution was willing to commit to the ongoing maintenance expenses that installation would entail. On November 28, 1926, exactly 43 years and 11 months after the cornerstone ceremony, the entrance was demolished, its component pieces scattered like those of every other element that had been deemed too expensive or difficult to save. The site, cleared to bedrock and leveled, stood empty through the winter of 1926 to 27, a vacant lot in the heart of Manhattan's most expensive real estate corridor. During these months of vacancy, the space attracted attention precisely because of its emptiness. Pedestrians paused at the corner, disoriented by the absence of a building they had seen daily for decades. Artists sketched the void. Photographers documented it. Newspapers ran occasional articles about what might eventually occupy the space. The vacancy represented a rupture in the city's spatial fabric, a missing tooth in the architectural streetscape that drew the eye precisely because it disrupted expectations. Snow accumulated on the raw earth. Wind whipped across the block, unimpeded by the walls that had broken its force for more than 40 years. And for a brief period, the site offered a glimpse of what the corner had looked like before Cornelius Vanderbilt had transformed it. A tabula rasa, a blank canvas awaiting the next chapter in its continuous reinvention. That chapter arrived in February 1927, when construction began on new commercial buildings. First, the Bergdorf Goodman department store on the southern portion of the lot. Later, additional retail structures on the northern section. These buildings, designed in the Art Deco style, then becoming fashionable, bore no architectural relationship to the mansion they replaced. Their limestone cladding echoed the cawn stone of the Vanderbilt house only coincidentally. Their setback profiles responded to new zoning laws rather than historical precedent. Their large display windows addressed commercial imperatives rather than residential privacy. The transition was complete. From chateau to department store, from private palace to public retail, from monument to one family to service for thousands of daily customers. No plaque marked the site's history. No indication suggested that anything of significance had previously stood there. The city, whose memory is architectural, had suffered a kind of selective amnesia, erasing one chapter to make room for the next.